Doing so would be, in fact, a major escalation, and now he has done that, likely forcing the U.S. and allies to impose severe sanctions they said would be coming if Russia moved to recognize their independence. Putin saying moments ago, I deem it necessary to immediately recognize the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. These are two regions of the Donbass region where Russian separatists have been living. They have been in conflict with Ukraine for some time. Vladimir Putin saying he will now recognize them as independent, drafting a document and signing it, he said, almost immediately. He did tell the Russian people that he then expected sanctions from the West almost immediately, saying they will likely come. This move is a violation of international law. The Russian military could now react by moving in those 150,000 troops that have been surrounding Ukraine. President Putin could use this as a pretext to then help the Russian separatists, again, within this region, the Donbass region there in eastern Ukraine, that he's now said he will declare as independent. Two separate areas within the Donbass region, he says, are and will be independent. We do know that, again, tens of thousands of Russian troops amassed on that border. The question now is whether or not Vladimir Putin will send any of those troops in to help secure this independence. He had a warning for Ukraine to end hostilities, and as the West had said he would likely do, he began to describe the situation in Ukraine the other way around, saying essentially that the hostilities are caused by the Ukrainians, that there are women, children, and elderly suffering at the hands of the Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine there, where Russian separatists, of course, have been living and controlling their own regions for some time, though not acknowledged by the Russians as independent. I want to bring in our senior foreign correspondent, Ian Pannell, and I know this can be somewhat confusing for people who've been watching this conflict, watching the West predict and prepare the world for what they believe could be coming. But Ian, this was precisely what the Biden administration was most concerned about, that he would recognize two key parts of the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine as independent now from Ukraine.
Yeah, David, I think this is the most dangerous moment in this crisis, and there are still many questions unanswered. Are we actually just seeing the end of the beginning of this crisis? In other words, has Vladimir Putin just laid out a smaller ambition just to officially recognize the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, these two tiny, small areas in the far east of Ukraine that are part of the bigger Donbass industrial region? The rebels, the Russian-supported, Kremlin-backed rebels, essentially control 30% of the Donbass, and the Ukrainian government controls 70%. Now, what follows on from this recognition of independence? Is it just that Russia will support them in their own governance, that things will calm down? I think the greater fear here, the very real fear, is that is not what Vladimir Putin said today. We were treated to this long, rambling, revisionist history of the history of Ukraine, essentially saying that it was a Soviet creation. But I think innate in all of that was this underlying thought by Vladimir Putin, which we've heard expressed before. He doesn't really recognize Ukraine as a sovereign, independent, strong country that should be treated as such. He sees it as an artificial creation and that it's harming Russia's interests. So if this declaration, if this recognition of independence then leads to greater military action, to the rolling in of Russian tanks, to an extension of the territory, then I think the larger fears of the Biden administration are really going to come to pass. If all that happens is you have this legislative process where you say, yes, we recognize your independence, but nothing else follows, which I don't think is going to happen, then perhaps we can breathe a little. But I don't think that's what we're looking at. I think we're looking at the start of a much more serious collision of events.
Ian, you talked about Vladimir Putin in addressing the Russian people, not holding anything back there. In fact, he talked about Ukraine wanting to become potentially a nuclear power again, saying they would want a nuclear weapon. He suggested that the West would help them with that. He talked about NATO growing, that was not a promise kept by the West over many, many years along the Russian border there. And Ian, I want to drill down on this point, though. The main question at this point is not whether or not Vladimir Vladimir Putin is going to officially acknowledge what he says is the independence of these two distinct areas of the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine. The question is whether or not he then believes it will be necessary to send in Russian military to help secure that independence.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that is a question that I think we've all got to be really focused on. What does it lead to? Do you then see the leaders of these two little statelets, if you like, then appeal to Russia, who's recognized its independence, and say, look, we're under attack by the Ukrainians? And that's the narrative that they've been portraying over the last 4 or 5 days, that we're under sustained attack, that they're committing genocide. They've used this word genocide against the Russian-speaking population there, that women, children and the elderly have to flee the country. We've seen a series of these bogus so-called false flag operations to justify the building up of armaments and support in the area. If they then appeal to Russia and Russia responds militarily, the question is, what does the Ukrainian military do? Does it just stand by and allow Russia to take over part of its territory? Does it stand and fight? And if it does, then that's when we're really in dangerous territory, because you have all those other Russian troops massed to the north in Belarus, to the south in Crimea. If they start to roll across the border, then the worst case scenario, which is what the Biden administration has been telling us all will happen, will come to pass. And all of this is centered on what was Vladimir Putin really asking for here? Did he just want these security guarantees that Ukraine was never going to join NATO? Or was this really about restoring the might of Russia, restoring the Russian Empire, not recognizing Ukraine as a valid country? And I'm afraid a lot of what we heard in this rambling speech tonight echoes those kinds of fears. And if that is the case, then I'm afraid we're entering a dark period.
And we should point out, Ian Pannell, thank you for outlining what we could be witnessing here along the Ukraine-Russian border, could be witnessing. Of course, we don't know the next move from Vladimir Putin, other than the fact that he has just declared before the Russian people that he will declare much of the Donbass region, those two regions in particular that are included, as independent from Ukraine. He said, if we then have to act, I am sure the Russian people will support the efforts. I want to go to our chief White House correspondent, Cecilia Vega, because the Biden administration, Cecilia, has been very clear on this. I know we're awaiting word whether or not they will impose severe sanctions immediately, whether they're going to continue to observe what happens next. In the meantime, you and I were talking before we came on the air that the State Department outlined this very scenario in recent days and what this would constitute if this was, in fact, the action that Vladimir Putin takes.
Yeah, and David, this is really important because European allies had explicitly warned Vladimir Putin to not go through with exactly what he is announcing that he is going to go through with right now. And the State Department, the administration, the Biden administration, did as well just a number of days ago. Secretary of State Antony Blinken had said that this would be a gross violation of international law. He said it would necessitate a swift and firm response from the United States in full coordination with all of our allies and partners. So while the ball is in Vladimir Putin's court for what happens next in terms of whether he decides to go for what Ian was just saying, a full-scale invasion, as the United States and the White House here have been predicting right now in these next immediate minutes, if not hours, the ball is in the court of Western allies and the White House to see how far they go with this package of sanctions. They have been deliberately vague leading up to this and not telling us what sanctions would entail, just that you have heard President Biden use this phrase, swift and severe sanctions. We know that it will be a massive package of sanctions. We know that the vice president over the weekend, when she was at that security conference in Munich, said that these would be some of the greatest sanctions, if not the strongest, that we have ever issued. And we also know, David, that allies, Western allies, are united on this front, that they are all threatening swift and severe sanctions. I think the question right now in terms of what these sanctions will look like is whether the administration and the allies decide to sort of scale this back just based on what Putin announced today. They had threatened these sanctions based on a full-scale invasion that they had been warning of. But in terms of what these sanctions potentially could look like, we're talking about Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the UK, just said the other day that we could be talking about preventing Russian companies from trading in British pounds and American dollars if Putin decides to invade. We're looking at everything from blocking Russia's access to technology, electronic supplies, things like cell phone parts, which would be a huge blow to the Russian people. people, cutting Russia off from the international banking system, even potentially targeting Vladimir Putin himself. So as we wait to see when and if the United States decides to go forward with these sanctions and what that looked like, David, I'll just give you a quick update because this really has been an extraordinary last few days here at this White House with this change in tone. The president was supposed to be in Delaware last night, and today he canceled that trip. He just not long ago here at the White House, he's inside right now behind me, wrapped up a meeting with some of the highest levels of this administration, his vice president. This was the National Security Council meeting. The Secretary of State was here. As I said, the vice president, Secretary of Defense. And you know this, David, you talked about this big question of whether President Biden and Vladimir Putin will sit down with a face-to-face meeting has had been floated after French President Macron's call with Putin yesterday. The White House announcing that perhaps there could be this meeting. But I will tell you, I'm being told by sources that this is a theoretical meeting, David, that it would only happen if an invasion does not take place. And right now, all the sources that I am talking to here at the White House still firmly believe that we are in this window for an invasion. And certainly what we just heard from Vladimir Putin right now, David, ratchets up this tension. There has been these incremental steps toward glimmers of hope in diplomacy, but you heard Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, say today an ominous warning that hour by hour, the hope for diplomacy is diminishing, given the behavior that we are seeing from Russia right now, David.
And you have to wonder if Vladimir Putin's announcement just moments ago before the Russian people that he will declare those two regions, the Donetsk region and the Lugansk region, both within the Donbass, as fully independent, whether or not that's a walking up to the line or has he crossed the line? The question is, will the sanctions kick in now, as Cecilia so definitely pointed out there, or whether or not they will continue to wait? There you see Vladimir Putin signing what we gather is, the documentation that backs up what he's now declared before the Russian people. In doing so, he warned the Ukrainians that hostilities must end in the Donbass region, or he warned that perhaps Russia would then have to take steps. He also said that if we do, I gather I will have the full support of the Russian people. You heard Cecilia mention the Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson. He, in fact, held a press conference at Downing Street as this was unfolding just moments ago. He said this move by Vladimir Putin is plainly in breach of international law, flagrant violation of the sovereignty, the integrity of Ukraine. He took it a step further even. He said, I think it's a very ill omen and a very dark sign that things are headed in the wrong direction. Our foreign correspondent, James Longman, is in Moscow. He, of course, was monitoring what Vladimir Putin was telling the Russian people. And, James, you've also been watching what we've been reporting here, which have been the images that the Russian people have been watching now for several days now. The West, the U.S. in particular, had warned of a false flag operation, or several of them, to build this narrative that the eastern portion of Ukraine had become very dangerous for these Russian separatists. It brought told thousands that they should evacuate and come into Russia. And now he has told the Russian people that Ukraine wants a nuclear weapon, that the West is helping them, that they did not keep their promises over many, many years as far as NATO expansion was concerned. This was Vladimir Putin basically telling the Russian people all of the things that he thinks the West has not kept their promises on. And the question now is whether or not this is the beginning, as Ian pointed out, of something much larger here.
Yeah, I think we really did see Putin unchained. And I think it's really important for people at home to realize that the way that this crisis has been packaged for Russians is the polar opposite of how all of us around the rest of the world understand it, which is that Ukraine is the aggressor. There is potentially genocide. He used the word there. He's used it time and time again, going on against Russian speakers in these separatist areas. There have been mass graves uncovered, war crimes committed. And the United States, together with its Western allies, has been, and he said it there, pumping weapons along with NATO into Ukraine. And so that is what Russians, a lot of them anyway, will understand of what is happening here. And so what we heard there from Vladimir Putin was this worldview that he draws his legitimacy from the past. This is the idea that he will rebuild the former Soviet Union. And he has people who are willing to listen to that message. We had a lot of these kind of ethno-religious, nationalist messages, the sentiment that the Orthodox Church was undermined. Kiev is preparing to act against the Orthodox Church, and like you said there, preparing to create nuclear weapons. I mean, it is known that Ukraine was a place where a lot of weapons ended up at the end of the Cold War. So he plays on these kind of thoughts and ideas or understandings that Russian people have, and then builds on them time and time again. I do think, though, that what's going to be really interesting to see, and you just said there about Boris Johnson swiftly condemning what he's heard, and we're likely to see this package of sanctions. It'd be really interesting to see just what the sanctions are, because let's perhaps look at maybe the possibility that for Vladimir Putin, was this the best, worst option for him? He didn't expect, perhaps, the West to show such a united front against him this time round. Remember, looking 2008 back to the war with Georgia, where it's the same playbook: annex, announce that an area is independent, and try to rebuild the Soviet Union. The Ukraine war last time round, the annexation of Crimea. Maybe he's trying to get out of it this time. Who knows?
Yeah, we certainly do not know. And as you pointed out there, James, the narrative that he has built over the last several days in Russia is precisely the same narrative that the West feared he would actually try to build and then express through the images that they've seen on Russian television and in the story that he told the Russian people there tonight. He talked about the same old words from the West. Nothing has changed in their position, that they have blackmailed us through sanctions and that they will likely sanction us again. The main question at this point, again, after declaring those two Russian-speaking, Russian separatist regions in the Donbass as independent, signing the document there moments ago, what appeared to be the document confirming what he told the Russian people. The question now is, does anything follow this as far as military steps, military intervention with some 150,000 plus Russian troops amassed all along the Ukrainian border, particularly in that region? You know, we've shown you the troops at the north, the south, and along the eastern front, which certainly borders the Donbass. I want to bring in our chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, who anchored this week from Ukraine over the weekend. And Martha, I know your sources in the U.S. military have been telling you all along you do not amass troops along the border this size, this scope, with military hospitals, clinics for blood, if you don't have a plan to follow suit with some sort of strategy here that would involve them.
And that starts with the Secretary of Defense on down. They do believe an invasion is coming. I don't think this speech changes it. It probably escalates it. You know, David, you keep referring to telling the Russian people. We have to remember what he did tonight was speak to his nation. Think about when our president speaks to the nation. If we are about to take military action or anything else, this was a very sobering speech for the Russian people, and what he laid out escalated this situation. He kept saying things like Ukraine is not just a neighbor, it is an inherent part of our history, our culture, our spiritual space. We cannot help but react to what Ukraine is doing. It is like a knife at our throat. He talks about NATO. He talks about the U.S. To me, this message was, if we lose Ukraine, we lose our empire. And the speech was indeed rambling, but the message was the same over and over and over. And as you said, David, they have 150,000 troops at least on all three sides of this country in a position that are refueled. The weapons are uploaded. They are ready to attack if Vladimir Putin gives the final say. We've already heard our president, President Biden, say he thinks Vladimir Putin has made a decision to invade. Now, whether this is a speech to his nation to say we don't have to invade the whole country, or whether it's going forward, I think most officials believe that an invasion is coming, David.
Martha, stick with me here, because I want to underscore a point you just made there with Vladimir Putin and the language he used when it came to Ukraine. He said, if we lose Ukraine. He also talked about the leadership, the president of Ukraine, essentially comparing Ukraine and the leadership there to being a puppet for the U.S., for the West. He talked about the Russian language not being used in Kyiv anymore, a sort of cleanse of the culture. There certainly was not a recognition of independence and sovereignty that the West is trying to protect for Ukraine.
None whatsoever, David, none at all. And that was the message. Look what he's doing to our Russia. Look what the United States is doing to our Russia. Look what NATO is doing to our Russia. Look what President Zelensky from the Ukraine is doing to us. They are the threat. We are not the threat. That is Putin's message from the beginning, but he laid it out in very, very stark terms.
Martha Raddatz with us from Ukraine. Martha, thank you again. Vladimir Putin telling the Russian people just moments ago the decision has been made now. His decision to recognize the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk, of course, two significant parts of the Donbass region, as independent. He said he warned the Ukrainians to end the hostilities, otherwise warning that there could be Russian action to follow. Of course, Western leaders fear that what we've been watching with the amassing of the troops along the eastern border with Ukraine could mean that he would possibly send in those troops to help secure that independence. You're looking at that small little area there that's surrounded in yellow lines there. That's the Donbass region, two significant areas of that. Vladimir Putin declaring as independent from Ukraine. Of course, these developments are moving quickly. As soon as we learn more from the Biden administration, the White House, about whether or not sanctions will be implemented immediately, we'll come back on the air and let you know. In the meantime, our coverage continues. ABC News Live, abcnews.com, and I'll be back with the entire team you just saw here on World News Tonight. I'm David Muir in New York. Good day.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diane Macedo. Thanks for streaming with us. Russian President Vladimir Putin just addressed the Russian people as tensions escalate in the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And we want to get to that breaking news. The Russian president telling the Russian people that he intends to recognize two separatist areas in eastern Ukraine as independent. And joining me now to talk about the consequences of that, White House correspondent Mary Alice Parks, ABC News' Elizabeth Schelsey from Washington, former Trump administration Homeland Security official Elizabeth Newman, and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, Mick Mulroy. So, Mary Alice, I want to start with you. We know that Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky also tweeted about a conversation that he had with President Biden while this whole announcement is coming about. So, what do we know about this call and the current conversations going on between these leaders?
Yeah, Diane, the White House has been telling us the last few days that President Biden has been in near constant contact with his counterpart, President Zelensky, in Ukraine. You saw there the tweet, the confirmation from President Zelensky that he spoke with Biden. The president has spent most of today huddled behind closed doors with no public events, instead meeting with senior members of his national security team, including the vice president, the joint chiefs of staff, or the chairman of the joint chiefs of staff, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State. Clearly, the president trying to stay up to date. The big question now is, how is the West going to respond? Just a few days ago, we saw the Secretary of State say that a move like this from President Putin would be, quote, a gross violation of international law and necessitate a swift and firm response. So I imagine that behind closed doors, President Biden is trying to decide and work with allies and partners on a response, on a unified response. The National Security Team has been telling us they are very aware that sanctions will only change Putin's calculus if they are done together as one bloc and one unified voice.
Ian, I want to go to Ian Panel, who's there in the Ukraine. Ian, what does this announcement mean for the Ukrainian people?
Coming to pass, I think we've just entered the most dangerous point in this crisis. I think the question is, what we've seen is that they've essentially, that Vladimir Putin has said that he recognizes the independence of these two small statelets. That isn't really the question tonight. The question is, what does that lead to? Of course, the West will have to decide what the consequences are for Vladimir Putin in terms of sanctions. But I think it's fanciful to imagine that it stops just there, that is all of Vladimir Putin's ambitions. If you listen to this long, rambling revisionism of history, he essentially said that Ukraine was a construct of the Soviet Union, that it was Russia who essentially created Ukraine. He undermined Ukraine's justification for its very existence, and therefore it kind of indicates that this isn't where it ends. You'll only need the leaders of these breakaway republics to then ask Vladimir Putin for assistance against the Ukrainians who are attacking in their eyes. There's no evidence to support that, but that's a narrative that they've been portraying, to then see these weapons start to roll across the border. In the words of one person on Twitter tonight, you don't need 190,000 troops around the borders to declare these these breakaway areas as independent. They're there for another purpose. Now, we're not on that territory yet, but that is the clear danger.
And Ian, we heard him say things like that Ukraine is a puppet for the United States. He threatened military action and told the Ukraine government to cease all military action or face full responsibility in those separatist areas. He's used words like genocide, implying there's a genocide of Russian people in those areas. How much is misinformation playing to all of this, and what are you seeing on the ground in terms of violence? I'm not sure if Ian can hear me now. We'll try to get him back. But Mary Alice, it's a little mind-boggling because we started the day with this sliver of hope for diplomacy, right? The White House signaling that President Biden was willing, at least in theory, to meet with President Putin as long as he didn't invade Ukraine. Where does that stand now?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine any summit like that going forward. And overnight, our White House sources were incredibly skeptical about the possibility of a summit. They told us that there was still overwhelming evidence that Putin planned to invade. And, you know, listening to Putin speak, I was reminded how day after day, week after week, we've been asking the White House if it was possible that all of these negotiations, all of this diplomatic effort could be used by Russia as a pretext, as sort of a ruse, that would it be possible that Putin was just playing the West and pretending to come to the negotiating table when they had already decided to invade, already put plans in place for extreme military action. And frankly, the White House said it was incredibly possible. It was completely possible. But we heard the Secretary of State, we heard the National Security Advisor say, nonetheless, they felt obligated to try. But listening to President Putin speak there, to talk so holistically about how he viewed the Russian Empire, to so dismiss the idea of Ukraine as an independent and sovereign nation that it has been for years, I was struck by that idea that maybe Putin never intended to come to the negotiating table.
And it sounds like we have Ian back. Ian, I want to go back to the question that I tried to ask you before, which is this reference to Ukraine being a puppet for the U.S. and this threat for the Ukrainian government to cease military operations in those separatist areas to stop the Russian genocide, as Vladimir Putin calls it, in those areas. How much is misinformation playing into all of this, and what is the real picture of the violence on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, this is the alternate universe in which the propaganda is being constructed. I mean, I couldn't agree with Mary Alice more. This is a much larger ambition that's been stated by Vladimir Putin here. This is about the restoration of Russian power, and it undermines any attempts at some kind of diplomatic resolution to this. It looks like Russia, it looks like Putin certainly wasn't interested in that. And if you look at the narrative that's being portrayed, to the Russian public, it's that the Ukrainian military is on the offensive. I mean, we even saw the Russian military today talk about 2 Russian armored personnel carriers that had crossed over into Russian territory that were taken out by Russian military forces. I mean, this is all fanciful. The attacks that have been cited over the last few days, these so-called false flags, in other words, manufactured crises to try and justify the intervention of Russia, has been almost childish if it weren't so serious, the way it's being conducted. But Russian state TV, pro-Russian, pro-Kremlin media is portraying this as the Ukrainians attacking the Russian-speaking minority there. We've seen Vladimir Putin and other senior members of the Russian cabinet use this offensive term of a genocide to refer to the treatment of the Russian-speaking population there without any evidence whatsoever. That's why they've encouraged people to evacuate from those territories, the women, the children, the elderly, because they're under attack. They're housing them in refugee tents across Russia. This has been totally manufactured by the Kremlin, by these breakaway republics to try and justify what we're now seeing. And it's exactly what the Biden administration has been saying all along would happen. And of course, they had to issue those warnings. And the longer those warnings went on without things coming to pass, people started to raise questions about how valid those warnings were. Well, we now know the answer. Those warnings were absolutely on the money. And what we're seeing now unfold is exactly what we were warned would happen. And the real fear is that what we're seeing now is not the end game. This is just the start.
Well, so I want to take that point and go to Elizabeth Schulze then with that, because Elizabeth, as Ian points out, the State Department, our U.S. government told us that this would happen. And we heard the State Department say that this would be a gross violation of international law if it did happen. So now what?
Well, Diane, there's no doubt that the U.S. and its allies see this as an escalation, and now it's really on them to say how are they going to respond to this escalation. We are already getting some reaction from allies, including UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who said this is very plainly a breach in international law. It's a sentiment that's also being echoed by the European Commissioner. So likely they are going to have to follow through now in saying, we have said that this is a threat. What are we going to do in response? Sanctions are the obvious choice here. The question is really how big of a sanctions they impose, as we've been talking about. Is it this full package that's being negotiated between the U.S. and its NATO and European allies, or is it a smaller part of that so that they leave other options on the table? And really part of that depends on whether this is the first of President Putin's moves or just the beginning of a bigger all-out attack, as Ian has pointed out.
And Elizabeth Newman, at your many years at DHS, you've had kind of been in the background of making some of these decisions for previous administrations. So what do you think? What is the right and likely response from NATO at this point?
Well, the most important thing is unity. We have seen NATO and the West unify in ways that we haven't seen them really since 9/11. So maintaining that unity is of the utmost importance, because that is the one thing that I think Putin didn't fully expect. I think he expected alliances to fracture, that there would be disagreement, and by maintaining that unity, it makes it harder for him to continue with his plans. Now, I still think he's going to invade, as Ian has suggested. There's just no reason that you put 190,000 troops, 75% of your forces on three sides of the country only for this small little territorial annex, if you will. So I do think he will proceed, but it is incredibly important for the U.S. to maintain unity with all of our Western allies, and whatever the decision is in terms of sanctions at this point, it needs to be a unified decision.
And so, Mick, that's the kind of financial response and diplomatic response. What do you think the military response is going to be to all of this?
Well, Diane, I would definitely agree with Elizabeth's point that we need to be unified. So both economic sanctions, and I would hope that some would be levied now, maybe not the most severe, but some. And to your question on military responses, I think we need to continue to look at what we need to ensure that NATO is completely bolstered and the defensive positions are in place. So if we need to send more forces to Eastern Europe, then I think we should look at doing that. I also think that as President Putin drags us on, we should increase the pressure and increase the negatives toward him. So if we are going to deliver more weapons and equipment to the Ukrainian army, we need to do it now. We need to publicly put that out there, and we need to prepare to send more, quite frankly, because we need to ensure that President Putin takes into his calculus that everything he's doing is exaggerating the very concerns that he claimed to be worried about. And we need to ensure that we increase those negatives toward him as he goes forward.
All right. Many thanks to you all for the analysis. We appreciate it. And we have much more on the Russia-Ukraine crisis coming up right after this break. Stay with us.
With so much at stake, so much on the line, more Americans turn here than any place else. ABC News World News Tonight with David Muir, America's #1 most watched newscast, now streaming on ABC News Live.
It was a scary time. In the 70s, you had multiple bodies showing up in Los Angeles.
There were so many murders happening. You had to have a name for it, serial killer.
There was a human head in there. This was premeditated evil.
We have this clock. This person is going to do this again.
It's me against the killer. Who's going to win?
We'll see who laughs last.
What came next was unlike anything they had ever seen.
Admit it. These days, what you need to know
seems to change just about every day.
What is it that you really want to know, need to know?
To help you not just get through your day,
but to make the most of it.
Feel smarter.
Feel better.
Feel happier.
Well, how about a third hour of Good Morning America?
GMA 3, what you need to know. Now streaming on ABC News Live.
It's all about you.
I risked my life. I put my family in danger. If I was caught, they would have put a bullet in my head. But it was the right thing to do. It was the only thing to do.
terror plot foiled in Garden City, Kansas.
That would have been one of the most deadly acts of domestic terrorism ever in the United States. It would have been Oklahoma City.
He put his family, himself, in jeopardy for us.
24 hours, assault on the Capitol. The ABC News original, exclusively on Hulu. Now streaming. This is what being live is all about. This is ABC News Live.
All right, we're gonna move back. Let's move back. We're surrounded by people squeezing into this bomb shelter.
We're on an urgent delivery run.
Not afraid to go there.
So my question, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
Breaking news, live events.
This is the moment.
Streaming straight to you, anytime, anywhere.
You just met one friend right here.
You're watching ABC News Live. Thanks for streaming with us.
National parks are incredibly safe places, but crime will happen.
Hey, Mama. My wife has fallen. She's in really critical condition.
At that time, I thought it was just a tragic accident. There's still a lot of questions we need to ask.
There were small things that didn't totally add up.
This is 2 lives for Harold that have died now. I was shocked. Something's not right.
ABC News, America's #1 news source.
Welcome back. Russian President Vladimir Putin just addressed the Russian people, revealing he intends to recognize the independence of 2 Russian-controlled separatist regions in eastern Ukraine. It's a move leaders in the West are concerned could spark a much larger conflict. For more on the developments, I want to go to former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker. Kurt, thanks so much for being here. How do you think NATO will and can respond to these new announcements by Putin today, and will they?
Well, I think there are several things. First off, we need to be prepared for what comes next. Just because he recognizes states doesn't mean that's it. Now they will likely call for military reinforcements from Russia. It could lead to an effort by Russia to take portions of the Donbas region of Luhansk and Donetsk that Russia does not currently occupy, but are still part of those administrative regions of Ukraine, and maybe they're part of what Russia is including as recognized. That may also then lead to skirmishes with Ukrainian forces as they take those territories, which could escalate. So there's a lot of things that could yet happen. I think NATO needs to be clear, A, that they reject this and won't accept Russia's recognition of these. Put in place the sanctions now that people have been promising for so long. There is nothing left to wait for. We need to get these sanctions in place. Increase our support to the Ukrainians in security assistance and training to give them every chance to defend themselves against what could be a major Russian invasion.
Now, is there a diplomatic path still possible, do you think, or are these latest actions by the Kremlin now taking us farther and farther away from that?
Well, if you're referring to the Minsk II negotiations about settlement in eastern Ukraine, that's now over. Minsk II is premised on the idea that these territories are part of Ukraine. By breaking them off and recognizing them as independent, Russia has now fully rejected the Minsk agreements. If you're talking about diplomacy to prevent a wider war against Ukraine, this still is possible, but it depends upon much greater show of strength by Ukraine and the West. Diplomacy works when it is backed up by strength and changes the conditions on the ground. As long as Putin thinks that he has the advantage militarily and can press it, he's not taking diplomacy seriously.
Now, are the warnings that the White House has given us throughout the past few days, it seems like they're coming true here. So what's on the horizon now? How do you think this plays out?
Well, I am still a little bit skeptical that Putin will try to take over all of Ukraine or even try to take major cities like Dnipro or Kyiv. The reason is that it's a vast country, a large population, and it would be very difficult to hold these territories after he had an initial military incursion. So I think he is still looking at more limited land grabs and continuing the pressure like this for a very long time, rather than trying to do everything at once. Even so, we need to be prepared, get our guard up, help the Ukrainians, and push back on this Russian aggression. As we heard in his speech, his ambitions are far larger than just Donbas. He sees the rebuilding of a Russian empire as what he is really embarking on.
All right, Kurt Roker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO. We appreciate it, Kurt. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have a live report from Ukraine with the latest after this break.
More Americans choose ABC News, America's #1 news source. This is what being live is all about. This is ABC News Live.
All right, we're gonna move back. Let's move back. We're surrounded by people squeezing into this bomb shelter.
We're on an urgent delivery run.
Not afraid to go there.
So my question, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
Breaking news, live events.
This is the moment.
Streaming straight to you, anytime, anywhere.
You just met one friend right here.
You're watching ABC News Live. Thanks for streaming with us.
Admit it. These days, what you need to know
Seems to change just about every day.
What is it that you really want to know, need to know?
To help you not just get through your day,
but to make the most of it. Feel smarter.
feel better.
Feel happier.
Well, how about a third hour of Good Morning America?
GMA 3, what you need to know. Now streaming on ABC News Live.
It's all about you.
Take America's #1 news with you, anywhere you go, anytime, free. Download the ABC News app now. Breaking news, exclusives, 24/7. There for you with one touch. The ABC News app. Download it now.
It was a scary time. In the 70s, you had multiple bodies showing up in Los Angeles.
There were so many murders happening. You had to have a name for it, serial killer.
There was a human head in there. This was premeditated evil.
We have this clock. This person is going to do this again.
It's me against the killer. Who's going to win?
We'll see who laughs last.
What came next was unlike anything they had ever seen.
All right, here we go. You ready? Let's do it.
Yes, it's the show America wants and America needs right now.
This is What Would You Do? Let's go. How are you? Yes.
So what will you be watching Saturdays on ABC News Live?
What would you do?
Hey, I guess I just found out.
The What Would You Do Marathon, 12 to 6 Eastern, every Saturday on ABC News Live.
My favorite show.
Christopher Steele.
The guy who picked a fight with 2 presidents, and he's lived to tell the tale.
That now infamous dossier.
Supposedly a tape showing prostitutes hired by Donald Trump urinating on a bed, and would be quite a tape if it in fact existed.
I said take out the PP tape.
It quickly became a question of how much of this was accurate.
This is the stuff of movies.
A lot of this is the stuff of movies.
The story of epic proportions.
Phony stuff.
It's a bunch of crap.
It changed history.
Now, with so much on the line, more Americans are turning to David Muir and ABC's World News Tonight than any other program across all of television.
Welcome back. The United States is renewing its warning that Russia could invade Ukraine at any moment amid escalating tensions in the region. President Vladimir Putin made a national TV address to Russians saying he intends to sign a decree recognizing the 2 Russian-led separatist republics in eastern Ukraine as independent. Now, that move violates Ukraine's sovereignty and essentially could blow up diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis. The U.S. and NATO allies are now weighing their response. And for more on all of this, let's bring in ABC News reporter Aaron Katersky, who's on the ground in Lviv, Ukraine now. Aaron, we're hearing in Russia that people are celebrating these developments. What kind of a reaction are you seeing in Ukraine?
Well, so far there's been a rather muted reaction, at least on the streets. It's late into the evening, but we know that in the presidential palace in Kyiv, President Zelensky has been on the phone with President Biden and with other world leaders, interested, no doubt, in what guarantees they could make about Ukrainian security going forward should President Putin decide to escalate this even further. And Russian state television did show images of what it said were spontaneous demonstrations of support after President Putin declared that the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk would be effectively sovereign. We're not sure whether those are staged. It's impossible to know whether those people that are there of their own free will or what. But if it's true, it does heed the call that we've heard coming out of eastern Ukraine for President Putin to take this very step. And crucially, Diane, it does now allow Vladimir Putin to claim that any subsequent invasion is effectively defensive, to come to the aid of the hundreds of thousands of Russian-speaking citizens who live in eastern Ukraine.
And Aaron, what did you make of the part of Putin's speech when he essentially said that Ukraine is Russia, that they are inherently Russian, and essentially that Ukraine is kind of an artificial country?
We got a history lecture from President Putin about the Soviet Union, about how Ukraine was formed. He sees it as a creation of the Bolsheviks that rightfully belongs to Russia. And the current government, President Zelensky, he called an American puppet. I'm not sure the people here in Ukraine would necessarily agree, but that's how Vladimir Putin sees it. And he seemed to be really laying the groundwork for what may be to come with his own people. This was a televised address in which he seemed to be comfortably seated in a chair and riffing without any apparent notes. And he's really talked about, I think, Diane, this was really a window into how he thinks about this. He seems to believe that Ukraine was stolen from Russia, made to become a Western puppet, and for all of the talk about what would happen with NATO or any nuclear armaments here, he really seems to believe that Ukraine rightfully belongs to an empire that he wants to control.
So, Aaron, going into today, diplomatic efforts already seemed unlikely but hopeful. Where are we now? Oh, it looks like we lost.
I'm here.
Aaron, can you hear me?
I hear you.
Okay, so Aaron, today it seemed like going into the day we had this kind of glimmer of hope for diplomacy, but potential meeting between Biden and Putin if he doesn't invade. Where does that hope stand now?
Well, it doesn't seem like there's going to be an awful lot of hope. We'll get an official word from the White House, but we've already heard from other Western leaders denouncing the action that President Putin took tonight to declare the sovereignty of these two territories in eastern Ukraine. And it does seem to all but dash hopes for a diplomatic solution. The question, though, is what Vladimir Putin does next. Will he be content to just leave it there, declaring these two independent territories, or is he going to move forward, sending Russian troops, rolling into Ukraine? If that happens, all diplomatic bets are off.
All right, Aaron Katersky, always great to have you, Aaron. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane.
And that does it for us right now. Thank you for joining us. I'm Diane Macedo. The news continues right after this break.